A warm welcome to everyone. In this video, we try to engage with a rather mysterious statement from Psalm 111, verse 10, which I shall presently read with you, and see what sense we can make of it. The text reads as follows, that Psalm 111, verse 11. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever. Let's focus on these words. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Many people, particularly young people, my own students, have asked me this question in the past. How come fear, which is a very negative and paralyzing emotion and state, has the potential to make us wise? In fact, we are used to thinking of just the opposite. Fear can make us act in foolish ways, which is also true. But what's important for us to remember here is that this is not any kind of fear, but the fear of the Lord. For example, the fear of a wild animal, the fear of a snake, the fear of a rowdy can make us act very foolishly. But the fear of the Lord can make us wise, and I believe in it. And therefore, I'm duty bound to explain to you the logic for the belief that I entertain. Now, first of all, let's get started. First of all of us will readily agree that fear is an acute emotion, or that is to say, we enter into a state of acute awareness in relation to what we fear. That's true about every kind of fear. For example, if you see a snake there, you will forget the whole world, you will focus entirely on the snake. Or if you think that there is somebody standing out there with a dagger intending to stick it into you, then the rest of the world will cease to exist, and all your concentration, all your awareness will be focused on that person alone. So the first thing to fix in our mind is that fear causes us to enter into a state of acute and all-absorbing concentration, focus. That much is obvious enough, and I hope it doesn't have to be explained any further. Now, what kind of states that we enter into, or the quality of the fear, the quality of the concentration in which we are, depends on what exactly is it that induces this fear. Obviously, the way we fear God will be very different from the way we fear a snake or a wild animal. Otherwise, our idea of God is seriously at fault. So, what is this state of acute awareness into which we are led by the fear of the Lord? In other words, what is it that we become acutely conscious of when we become aware of the Lord? God awareness instills a very healthy fear in us. Not a negative, not a destructive, not a paralyzing state, but a very affirmative, empowering, enriching state, which is a reflection also on the being of God. So if our relationship with God does not put us into that kind of state in which we have the potential to become wise, then what we are relating to is not God, but something that we have invented to substitute for God. And it's important for us to realize that by virtue of our religious training and upbringing, we have got so used to substituting God with all kinds of things. A good illustration is the Kripasanam, which is a religious hypermarket which flourishes in Kerala, where people are encouraged to go only through Mary, who is supposed to be the dispenser of special gifts and mercies and so on and so forth. So Mary becomes virtually the substitute for God, substitute for Jesus. Though, if I put it this way, Catholics will vehemently disagree with me, but for all practical purposes, Mary becomes a substitute. For the Catholic Church in general, the Church becomes a substitute for God. And I don't think any well informed Catholic will dispute this idea. If anyone is not confused, please read Auguste Comte, Augste Comte, pronounced Kant, who said the Catholic Church should not be called a church at all, rather, it should be called the Catholic system. Because what's important vis-a-vis the Catholic Church is not really Jesus or the idea of God, it's the total system, the most efficient system ever invented by the genius of man. But that's the opinion of a very, very well-informed Catholic philosopher. He was not a Protestant philosopher. He was a Catholic philosopher based in France. He was a French Catholic philosopher of great distinction. The whole positivist philosophy is the creation of Auguste Comte, and John Stuart Mill made a heroic effort to popularize the writings, the philosophy of Auguste Comte in England at that time. So is that important? I mean, Mill himself was an intellectual giant, and for him to be so impressed with the writings of Kant, but I have to also say that Mill was also aware of the limitations of Kant's philosophical, positivist philosophical system. So this God awareness. I was saying that the church sometimes becomes a substitute for God awareness. That is to say, as is now fairly well known, that people are least aware of God when they are in the church. They're aware of various things. We're aware of the beauty of the church, the profundity or the aesthetic appeal of the liturgy. They're aware of the competence of the priest. They're aware of the people around. They're aware of the tradition, the customs, the practices, the expectations, so on and so forth. A very comprehensive survey covering the religious attitudes of people was conducted in the United States of America by a very famous research foundation called the Pew Foundation. The survey covered some 2,500 congregations belonging to various traditions. And one of the questions asked in the survey was as to what extent people are aware of God when they are inside the church. Believe you me, the finding was that 85% of the respondents to the survey said that they were least aware of God when they were inside the church. Whether this is an exaggeration or not, you decide for yourself. I'm only telling you the findings elicited by this very famous Pew Foundation research. And you can actually look that up in the internet. So now I was talking about God awareness. Now the fear of the Lord has this very positive aspect, this beneficial influence upon us, that it makes us stay focused on, centered on God. It increases God awareness in us. Otherwise, for us, for the most part of our life, God is a very vague presence somewhere out there. We are most vague and unclear about everything pertaining to God and our relationship with God, though we attach theoretically maximum importance to our relationship with God. And we think that we value our relationship to God such an extent that we are willing to risk everything. All to Jesus I surrender, the famous hymn and all that. But in point of fact, if truth be told, the ground reality is very different. We are least God aware. This is something that we have to. Now, let's understand this in the light of a parable that Jesus taught. You see that parable in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. verses 9 to 14. I'm not going to read the text of that parable. It's a very familiar parable. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. In this parable, Jesus introduces two characters to us, a Pharisee and a publican. Publican is a tax collector. So it's a parable of two people going into the synagogue to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector or a publican. Now, the Pharisee, Jesus is extremely creative and very suggestive and brutally honest. He's not very tactful. He says the Pharisee prayed in a typical fashion. He went there to advertise his merit. In other words, he's telling God, look, I lack nothing. I'm perfect. I've arrived. I do everything. You can't find fault with me, God. You may find fault with yourself, but you can't find fault with me. I stick to the last tittle of all my religious responsibilities. And I'm impeccable in my religious practices. So please congratulate me. Pat me on my back. That's how he prays. In contrast, this poor man, this publican, this tax collector, whom the Jews as a society despised and expected no good from him, Jesus portrays him in a shocking manner, and shocking manner to the Jews, that is. He stands at a distance and does not even dare to look up to God, and he confesses his miserable state. He says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. In some version, the sinner. Now you tell me, between the Pharisee and the publican, who was more God aware? Obviously, the publican or the tax collector. And the important thing to remember is the hallmark, the insignia of our God awareness is that we become sincerely aware of our limitations, our imperfections, aware of what is lacking in us, which then becomes the hidden inner motivation to move to a higher stage of evolution and a step closer to perfection. In this context, we must remember the exhortation of Jesus Christ as found in the 48th verse of the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus says, be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, there again, Jesus makes it very clear that the immediate and necessary outcome of our God awareness is that we become aware of our deficiencies, our lacuna, our inadequacies, or what is lacking in us, what is deficient in us. Not only that, from there we don't slink away in self-revulsion or in an awkward state of despising oneself, wanting to go and hide oneself in front of the presence of God. Rather, this God awareness, and that's the positive and affirmative aspect of the fear of the Lord. It first makes us aware of where we stand in truth, and we suddenly realize that we are nowhere near the mark. We have a long way to go. But there, at that point, there are two possibilities. You say, well, it's far beyond me. There is no way I can reach that level. So I just go, I get lost. The other is, no, I count on God's mercy. He's able to do exceeding abundantly, as Paul says when he writes to the Philippians. He's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. Two words, ask or think. So I take encouragement, I derive encouragement from this affirmation, and I go forward. So I seek perfection. I want to be better tomorrow than I am today. That is the beneficial, positive, affirmative impact of the fear of God. So in this sense, the fear of God is completely different from fearing a snake or a mad dog or a wild animal or a thug armed with a dagger or whatever. So that's something that we have to be very, very clear about. So, as against the Pharisee, who, because he was least God aware, he became most self aware. And when we are only self aware, we are apt to think of ourselves as a paragon of virtue, religious and otherwise, And we think that the whole world has a duty to look at us and admire us to the extent that we like to be admired. On the other hand, when we are really sincerely God aware, we become aware, in the words of the American poet Robert Frost, I have miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So this becomes then the inner motivation to seek perfection. And surely, if you seek perfection, its necessary outcome, or if it's byproduct, if you like, is that you become wise. You become wiser and wiser and wiser. And that's definitely a very healthy and desirable state. So, the function, the life enriching, personality refining function, the positive impact of the fear of the Lord, as the psalmist envisages it, is that it produces in us positive God awareness, which results in positive self awareness, which does two things. One, first of all, recognizes the aspects of our present condition where we need to improve. Secondly, it encourages us to go further forward so that we can be better tomorrow than we are today. That's the positive aspect. So, in this context, let's now remember another statement by Jesus. You find that in the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the Beatitudes, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, obviously, if you look at that parable that we have already seen, the one who is blessed in the spirit is the sinner, the publican. The one who is poor in the rich in the spirit, according to his own assessment, is the Pharisee. And the man who is poor in the spirit becomes blessed in the sense that he realizes that he has to improve himself, and he'll go and do whatever he can to improve himself. Whereas the priest will stay exactly the same way. He will not improve himself by a tittle, and he'll stay frozen and paralyzed like that. So, this is the spiritual poverty Jesus talks about. But for this, poverty cannot be an item of blessedness. Blessed are the poor in spirit, because they will realize, because they got consciousness, they will realize the aspects of their condition and their personality in relation to which they need to improve, and improve very much. Then they will do everything possible to attain that degree of perfection, and which of course generate blessedness, which stands to reason. And Jesus therefore identifies the secret of this blessedness. And you find that in the 15th chapter of John's Gospel, verse 4, a verse that I'm excessively fond of. The secret of that richness is abiding in God. So paradoxically, the fear of the Lord draws us closer and closer and closer to the Lord, whereas the fear of anything else drives us farther and farther away from it. If you fear a snake, you would want to keep the maximum distance between you and the snake. If you fear the Lord Jesus Christ, you want to be one with Him. In fact, you want to abide in Him. That's a paradox, and that needs to be clearly grasped. So, it is to such people that Jesus issues this invitation that we find in the 11th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verse 28, a passage that all of us, in fact, know by heart. Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So it is in that state of abiding in God that we find our rest. And that is tremendous wisdom, that is tremendous blessedness, and that's how the fear of the Lord becomes the reason for our wisdom. So, either we abide in the Lord, or as a rich man in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man found in the 16th chapter of Luke's Gospel, abide in their own mansions. In portraying the rich man in that parable, who is not given a name, therefore he represents all the rich people in the world, or all the people in the world who care only for material richness and not spiritual wealth. They have no name. So this man represents all of them. They want only to live in their own mansions upon this earth, and therefore it makes sense that in the world to come, this rich man is in a rather desperate plight, whereas Lazarus, who did not have anywhere, did not have a shelter or a roof over his head, he is in rather comfortable circumstances, which is poetically imagined as being seated in the lap of Abraham, who is the father of faith. So, heaven is only for the Lazaruses of this world. That's something that Jesus makes bold to say. And this is one of the reasons why the rich people are not particularly fond of Jesus Christ. And therefore, church which is constantly concerned about keeping the rich in the world well humored will keep Jesus um, outside the premises of the church, as found in the Laodicean church, chapter 3 of the book of Revelation, where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand and knock at the gate," is the gate of the church. They don't let Jesus in because it's a rich church. It's very explicitly stated there that the Laodicean church was a rich church, and therefore it makes good sense that they were wise enough, worldly wise enough, not to allow Jesus to come into the picture, because if he came in, he would be a source of great discomfiture for the rich who make the church very rich. The church does not have much use for the poor of the world, because after all, even if they're as extravagant as the widow that Jesus acclaims in the gospel, the widow who cast her 2 little copper coins into the temple treasury, which Jesus takes a special note of and acclaims forever. And the church will have no value for such people, because after all, even if you get thousands of such small copper coins, it's of no value. Whereas the mighty contributions made by rich men, and such contributions can be expected only from the mighty rich, they make a substantial difference. And therefore, the way the church looks at the rich and the way the church looks at the poor are radically different. Therefore, from the church's point of view, you have to be rather insincere to believe that the poor in the spirit and the poor of the world are in a state of blessedness. But Jesus says that's how it is, whether you like it or not. And I have not really seen the church preaching the blessedness of the spiritual poverty and the blessedness of poverty itself throughout my lifetime. In fact, the preaching is all about the other way around, how God will rich you, will bless you with limitless wealth if you are in the good books of God. So heaven is, it seems, reserved for the likes of Lazarus and the rich of the world, the rich in religion, the rich in politics, the rich in worldly wealth. They seem to be headed to the warmer hospitality of hell. So that's something. In fact, you don't expect wisdom from people of this category. Please don't expect wisdom from the rich of the world. This is not what I am saying. This is what a great philosopher called Immanuel Kant said. If you read that tiny volume, Kant's Ideas and Education, you see this comment by Kant. He said, people who are brought up in comfortable circumstances, who are protected from the sting of life, the struggle of life, they rarely have the opportunity to develop their capacity. They certainly do not become wise, because wisdom is born out of the real struggle and the suffering in this world, to which only the poor are exposed. Those who live in comfortable circumstances of life, particularly those who grow up in palaces, are in a very pathetic condition because they have zero chance of becoming wise. In fact, he makes the explicit statement that's very rarely that somebody who's born in a palace and raised in the comforts and security of the palace proves a wise person. Well, that is Immanuel Kant's view, and Jesus also seems to have thought in a similar fashion. Anyway, so let's come back to the verse in the 111th Psalm, verse 11. Is it, remember, 111? Psalm 111, verse 11. Psalm 111, verse 11. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I hope we have been able to arrive at some sensible understanding of its meaning, with which many people have expressed their difficulty. They don't understand how fear, as a very negative emotion, can ever make a person wise. The explanation I have offered is that fear increases in you, the fear of the Lord increases in you God awareness, and that then makes you aware of your lacuna and your deficiencies. Not only that, it also gives you the inspiration, the encouragement to go forward and to make up for all the deficiencies, so that, as Jesus says, be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect. That exhortation by Jesus can be fulfilled. And the outcome of fulfilling that exhortation definitely will be blessedness. Hence the teaching, blessed are the poor in spirit. And I feel ideally these two verses should be read together, namely, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And this other saying, which is part of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. And if you read them together, you arrive at the interpretation or the understanding that I have just now shared with you. I hope you ponder over the contents of this video. And if you have any further questions, if there is any area of understanding that still remains dark or in twilight, please let me know. That also enabled me to think further and to attain a greater or higher degree of clarity regarding these ideas. Once again, I need to reassure all of you that I greatly value our partnership in creating this spiritual resource, not just for the Christian community, but for anyone who cares to value life and to live one's life in meaning, in dignity, and in an affirmative spirit, respecting its great potential and seeing the wonderful and glorious purposes of God working themselves out through you and all that you are involved in. May you become a blessing in the life of many. Remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, 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 which is to be desired above all else. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.